Bonnie, and I'm going to start us right on time. I'm delighted to be able to introduce our keynote for CTL's Techknowledgy conference today, or our symposium today. And I just want to take a minute to acknowledge where our really cute phrase, technology, the title comes from. Bonnie Sadler-Takash and I co-chaired the Festival of Teaching this year, and we were in a car with a bunch of graduate students, Bonnie's graduate students from art and design, and we were out leaving for an event that was happening in Camrose at Augustana campus, and I thought, look at this group of creative, clever people. I'm going to give them a task. And so I said, we have a symposium coming up in August. It's about technology, and it's about pedagogy. What is the title that we should use? And about 20 minutes out of Camrose, one of Bonnie's excellent students came up with this term, technology. It's a keeper. We're going to keep it forever. So a plug for art and design in the Faculty of Arts and Bonnie and her students. So speaking of clever and creative people, I'm pleased to introduce Norm Friesen. Norm is an associate professor in educational technology at the College of Education at Boise State University. He's the author of several volumes, including Rethinking E-Learning Research, Foundations, Methods, and Practices in 2009, and The Place of the Classroom and the Space of the Screen, Relational Pedagogy and Internet Technology, 2011. He's also the associate editor of the Journal of Curriculum Studies and E-Learning and Digital Media. He has worked at a number of institutions. He did his postdoc at Simon Fraser. He was the Canada Research Chair in E-Learning Practices at Thompson Rivers before he started at Boise. But most importantly, his graduate work was right here at the U of A, and so he is back for this, and he's back visiting family, and it's wonderful to have you here. He's going to talk to us today with a presentation entitled Simulation, Stimulation, and Silence, Learning Online and Off. In this talk, he is going to use examples that explore the nature of both pedagogy and technology in terms of their suitability for online, face-to-face, and also blended contexts. Norm.
Thanks so much, Cherie. And thank you, everybody. It's great to see you all here on this wonderful August day. And I was talking about the title of the talk over dinner last night with some of my colleagues at the Center for Teaching and Learning. And so they were wondering about where the stimulation was. Because I'm definitely going to be talking about simulation and silence. So here's a bit of stimulation. It's a joke. If there are any idiots in the room, they will please stand up, said the sarcastic teacher. After a long silence, one first-year student rose to his feet. And the teacher says, now then, mister, why do you consider yourself an idiot? Sort of like me standing up in front here. The teacher inquired with a sneer. Well, actually, I don't, but I hate to see you standing up there all by yourself. So one of the things about this joke that's important is the ambiguity of silence. And I'm going to talk about the ambiguity of silence at the very end of my presentation. By the way, this presentation is based on the dissertation that I did at this university with Dr. Max van Manen. And that dissertation I later turned into a book called The Place of the Classroom and the Space of the Screen. It came out in 2011 from Peter Lang. You can find it on Amazon. So let me just begin by talking about simulation, and then I'll go on to silence. So Mark Prensky, who here has heard of Mark Prensky? I assume just about, oh, okay. Well, Mark Prensky is somebody who's written a book called, or wrote an article called Digital Natives, Digital Immigrants. So he invented the word digital natives, as far as I can tell. And he encourages the use of simulations and educational video games for all types of teaching and learning. He says that there is no subject too involved or too sensitive for which he, quote, cannot come up with a game or other digital native method for learning it. Classical philosophy? Well, create a game in which the philosophers debate and the learners have to pick out what each philosopher would say. The Holocaust? Create a simulation where students role play the meeting at Wannsee, or where they can experience the true horror of the camps as opposed to films like Schindler's List. But of course, I hope that these ideas create some pause for thought rather than enthusiasm for simulation. Because simulating the horrors of the Holocaust, something sounds slightly wrong about that in my mind. And also, I think it would be sort of different to there'd be a big difference between engaging in a debate and picking out what a philosopher might say in a particular debate or context. And I want to explore some of these types of questions and differences. And what I want to do is to do that by looking at a specific set of experiences. The set of experiences involved are the experience of engaging in a dissection in a lab, just a basic, high school or undergraduate dissection experience in a face-to-face classroom or lab, and one that's online. And I begin with a brief descriptive analysis or study of these two types of experiences, and I follow with a more general analysis of what the virtual or hyperreal are and what that means in terms of communication and also experience. Over the last decade or more, there have been a lot of debates about animal dissection. And so as a part of these debates about the ethics and about the student preferences, there's been a lot of descriptive studies that have been done. And so I use some of the material that's been generated through these studies to look at the experience of animal dissection in a classroom or a lab. These accounts of classroom dissection typically follow a common sequence of events, and there are some fairly clear experiential patterns and moments that emerge. One important moment that emerges right away is that students typically notice the animal when they walk into the classroom. They'll notice flattened rats in a jar, little dead pigs that are lying in a sink, or a jar of pickled animals, or simply a creature that's tossed into a plate. And this is accompanied often by strong impressions of smell, for example, of formaldehyde, which refuses to leave your hands, or even of rotting flesh, which gets a little riper with each passing session. A second key experiential moment is in the second quote on this slide. It's about making the first incision and coming into contact with the animal carcass. The initial incision, the transforming cut, and the only one made into a body that bears the obvious markers of animal, is frequently the hardest one for students to make. Even some students who have never dissected predict that opening the animal would be the hardest part. And students' comments at this point give special emphasis to the embodied character of this moment. So both their bodies and the body of the animal are key. The first day, I thought I was just going to be sick when Linda was actually slicing this pig open. I felt nauseated. I don't handle blood and that kind of stuff very well. I was very glad that it didn't have any blood in it. If it was a pig that just had died and had blood, I would not have been able to handle it. So this is a question of, an embodied response, an ability to kind of like stay there and be involved, or having to sort of essentially like leave the room. So this is one of the second sort of key experiential moments. Now, we all know that there are really well thought out and clearly identified reasons for dissection, whether it's virtual or in class. And these include things like having a knowledge of the structure and function of the organs of the animal, or the ability to safely select and use the dissection apparatus and materials. However, experientially, these types of cognitive type knowledge or intellectual concerns are overshadowed by embodied or much more sort of affective types of impressions. Now, a virtual frog dissection, and I've used the same one. I did my dissertation in 2003, and this frog guts dissection was available then, and it's still available now. It's been improved a lot and changed. And so in my presentation, I kind of reference a couple of different versions of it. But the key thing is that you get access to it not by walking into a classroom and smelling the formaldehyde when you enter, but by clicking on a link like this one. And you can see that this sequence will progress for some time, and what I'll do is I'll just talk about what's happening. So in this latest version, they go through a description of the class and the genus of the animal, and explain how some of its basic characteristics, essentially. So after this brief introduction, the student is asked to fasten the frog to the tray. And this is accomplished through a series of mouse clicks. So I'm just going to flip over to this other version. The mouse clicks, of course, apply to the pins and pinning down the parts of the frog. Next, a red line running up and down the length of the frog's abdomen appears, and the student is asked to make 3 incisions along the dotted red line. This is done by clicking and dragging along with this scalpel that you see here on the frog's glistening underbelly. Any sense of unease that one might feel at taking a simulated scalpel to the simulated surface appears to be in conflict with other sensations, or lack of sensations. There are no unpleasant sounds or unusual feelings of resistance or elasticity, no moist membrane to puncture or incise, only the frictionless gliding of the cursor along the computer screen. Next, the dissection software shows the student a pair of scissors, and the student is then asked to cut in a particular direction, but at midpoint, they're asked to adjust the position of the scissors and to cut in a slightly different way to avoid causing any damage to the internal organs while they're making the cut. Finally, the internal organs of the frog are visible. They can now be examined through the use of a magnifying glass and a writing pad that are now made available in the simulation. When an organ becomes visible through the magnifying glass, a label identifying this organ appears. Then a click of the mouse causes the name of the organ to be written on the notepad, as illustrated here. So what is most obvious about this simulation is, when we think about the classroom dissection, is what is absent. There's no smell of rotting flesh or formaldehyde. There's no fear of that blood or any other liquid might come spurting out from the creature that's being dissected. Instead of first seeing the animal lying in a sink or flattened in a jar, we see Adobe Flash introduction. And handling and even cutting into the animal is then a matter of clicking on the correct buttons in sequence and gliding the simulated scalpel across part of the screen. Before I go and talk about hyperreality and the experience of hyperreality, I just want to look at the lab context for just one more second. A third key moment in the laboratory dissection is what's known, or what has been called, de-animalization or distantiation. One study describes how some students covered the face of the animals they were dissecting. One of these same students explained, every time we worked with the pig, worked on it, the face was covered. I couldn't cut the face. I could watch, and once the face was cut, it didn't look like a pig anymore. And I could deal with that because, it looked like a scientific experiment to me. In place of the strong embodied reactions like sickness or nausea, something different is emerging experientially at this point in the dissection. The activity becomes more intellectual or cognitive, and the learning outcomes that I mentioned earlier become more relevant. For example, one interviewee described what was revealed in dissecting a rat as a kind of marvel. All of these body parts fitting and working together neatly, like some beautiful type of a wet machine. Others report hearing comments like, God, his liver is like a mushroom or something. His heart's kind of tough. Feel that. Or look at that, oh, it's got a weird texture. It is still worth noting, though, that even though there is some distantiation and intellectualization, there's a certain sensory richness that remains. One that is mostly tactile, it seems, about feeling the animal's parts. So the experiential possibilities and limitations presented by simulated and lab dissections can be further explored by looking at how people have understood the hyperreal in philosophy. And Albert Borgman is a philosopher who's been at the University of Montana for quite a while, and I had an opportunity to be in touch with him about this article. Actually, a number of philosophers of technology and others, people who study technology, responded to this article in a special issue of the journal TECHKNOWLEDGY. And we had a really great discussion, and I was able to also write a reply to their responses as well. In any case, Albert Borgman says that virtual contexts and objects, and he was actually being critical in this article, but I think you can also take this positively, or even both positively and negatively, says that virtual contexts or objects are particularly pliable, brilliant, discontinuous, and disposable. Hyperreal objects are pliable, specifically in the sense that they can be, quote, entirely subjected to desire and manipulation. And when we think about the frog dissection, it's pretty easy to see this. the ease of slicing the frog open, revealing its organs, and then inspecting them with a magnifying glass and noting them with pencil and paper. No one tool or task online is fundamentally different from any other in the approach or attitude that it requires. So for example, when you switch from a scalpel to a magnifying glass to a pen and pad or paper, there is no eye to be brought to the magnifying glass. There's no scalpel to pierce through the animal tissue. For all of these steps or tasks, all that is required is a series of relatively repetitive mouse clicks, all the while sitting in front of a computer screen or working with a tablet on your lap. Borgman describes the discontinuous and disposable nature of hyperreality in terms of context. This is the last quote here. To be disposable, hyperreality must be experientially discontinuous with its context. It needs to be part of a computer screen. If it were deeply rooted in its setting, it would take a laborious and protracted effort to deracinate or uproot it and replace it. Reality encumbers and confines. The classroom dissection provides many examples of encumbrance and confinement. There's the persistent and unpleasant odor. There are irreversible incisions. You can actually make a mistake and not be able to, you might be missing an organ or not be able to find a certain part of the animal later in the dissection process. There are dangers where you're working with a sharp scalpel, and of course there are challenges for the environment and for student safety that have prompted a lot of the debates about the ethical nature of that type of dissection and on the students' abilities to opt out or to choose an alternative. On the other hand, the virtual dissection has undo and redo options that are readily available. And these are not so much convenient features that somebody figured that they would add as they are intrinsic properties of an online context or a virtual world. In this world, after all, is one that can be rebooted, refreshed, and even shut down at will. Hyperreality is also brilliant, and according to Borgman, has the characteristic of brilliance. And this is key, and this offers a lot of the instructional advantages of online simulations. And the way Borgman describes brilliance is as follows. The truly brilliant reality would exclude all unwanted information. I think this is here, yeah. He refers to it in terms of an absence of noise and a heightening of an object's attractive features. So it would exclude all unwanted information, and it would also highlight that information which is most important when it is most relevant. So this obviously, as a general instructional sort of property of this of online context, is something that has almost endless instructional possibilities. And this is something that has been pointed out in the instructional design literature. So if you look at what people have said about simulations and how simulations should be designed, starting in back in the 90s or in the 80s, you'll read things such as follows. You only need to simulate those experiences or those events and characteristics that allow the learner to perform in a proficient manner when performing in the operational environment, in other words, the real world. This representation of characteristics of simulation has been characterized by Gagné, who made key contributions to lesson planning and understandings of learning, and later by Clariana and in the following formula. Simulation equals reality minus task-irrelevant elements. And again, this fits with what Borgman is saying about brilliance. You can easily take out those task-irrelevant elements and just focus on what is the relevant part of the reality that, or the dissection that the student is working with. But there's, of course, important differences in terms of learning that we need to think about when we're comparing these two contexts. First, the animal being dissected in the classroom or the lab is organic in its origin, development, and growth. Online, the object being handled is designed according to specific goals or objectives. The animal's development and growth does not revolve around explicit educational objectives, but occurs for reasons, if we can call them that are quite different and that can be discussed or understood in a number of different ways. In evolutionary terms, would be one of them. So the animal that's dissected develops on its own for purposes that are at best implicit and not directly reducible to instructional or even human ends. Like any other piece of software, the simulation is operated by an interface, and this is a really key point. The interface that mediates between the representations of the animal and the human manipulating it is key. Buttons, mouse, keyboard, touchscreen, etc. allow access and control of the various components and tools of the simulation. The language of interface design reveals some really interesting patterns or terms in this connection. So if you look at the way designers or even just reviewers of software describe the experience, they talk about seamlessness, transparency, translucency, playability, learnability, flow, and intuitiveness, or even intentionality as key attributes, as positive attributes of a well-designed interface. It is not surprising that one of the key goals of interface design is a kind of comfortable certainty and familiarity. So when they started to design the Windows interface, for example, back in Xerox PARC in the 60s, they wanted something that would act like the physical world, right? So that you could drag and drop things and move things around physically. And that's how we operate in the world as ever since we were babies or children. And everybody, they figured, would know this. And so that's what they wanted to create. This type of experience, moreover, connects with how everyday normal experience is structured ever since we were engaged in any of those experiences. So as Edmund Husserl and other phenomenologists have shown, our experience is structured through intentionality. This is the word that phenomenologists use to describe how we order the booming, buzzing confusion of sense impressions. This refers to everyday purposes, plans, and categories that connect us with the world around us. It renders the world familiar. It enables us, as Husserl says, to live in certainty of the world. So when we're walking towards a door, intentionally we're already at that door, we've opened it, and we're moving forward. And this is how our movement towards the door is structured in terms of those plans and intentions. Now, computers, and particularly their interfaces, are designed to anticipate and facilitate this intentional flow. They allow us to do what we want to do when we want to do it. In the dissection exercise, scissors appear exactly when an incision is required, and a magnifying glass takes their place when a closer inspection is needed. The smoothly flowing movement from one tool to another is supposed to provide students with an experience of uninterrupted transparency and flow, and a sustained but pre-reflective assurance of what Husserl has called living in the certainty of the world. But flow can be both good and bad when we think about instruction. And I've already mentioned how it can be good because it can highlight those things which are important and downplay those things which are not so important. Possible experiences of strangeness, otherness, disruption, and surprise are to be avoided in order for flow to continue. The student consequently remains in the world of computer controls and images, a world of culture that is in some ways probably all too familiar and certain for them. But someone might respond, so this is what the student is encountering through this interface in some ways is a world that, at least on the interface level, is familiar. What interrupts flow, or the certainty of the world that software works so hard to maintain, is something that comes from the outside, something that is foreign, other, or alien. And this other, according to phenomenologist Bernard Waldenfels, is something that is manifest as a kind of disruption of our expectations, a type of a disruption of the self, its world, its plans and intentions. Waldenfels goes so far as to describe it as an upheaval, and he adds, as far as such upheavals are concerned, one can only yield to them or withdraw from them. Yielding is a key term here, and when I conclude in a moment, it'll appear again in terms of the experience of silence. One could say that this choice between yielding and withdrawing may capture the situation faced by students when they're initially asked to engage in an in-class dissection exercise. So now I'll conclude by briefly applying some of these ideas to the experience of online discussion rather than dissection. Now, when we are engaged with others online, it's quite a different experience, of course, than simulation, right? The categories of flow, or the categories of brilliance and pliability don't apply in the same way. Let's just imagine, like, being engaged in an online discussion that's text-based. And what I did in my book and in the dissertation to study these is look at the experience of silence. How do we tease apart the differences between engaging in communication in a context like this one versus online? Well, one way to start looking at some of those differences is by thinking about what silence means in either of those two contexts. So, and this also applies, though, to Skype or to other types of online communication where there's technical mediation involved. So the difference between silence in a face-to-face classroom discussion or in terms of, let's say, waiting for a reply to an email is kind of different. If you think about some of the possible responses or ways of understanding the silence, of course, a lot of them would fall in the middle and be common to both. But if you imagine a Venn diagram with the two circles, right, there's going to be some stuff that's going to fall outside of that shared set of common explanations. They're not the same in both cases. Online communicative spaces have a particular bias towards active communication. So I have a lapel mic, for example, right? And so one of the things would be that you would expect me to do is to walk around and to move around because I have that freedom with the technology. If I were to stay in the same place like I've been doing most of the time, it's sort of a suboptimal use of the technology instructionally, right? This also applies to online contexts. If you have in front of you an open browser window with a text box where you're supposed to type something in, well, you're supposed to type something in, right? Or if the phone rings, you're supposed to answer it. This is a bit different than being physically co-present in the same environment. It doesn't have some of the same flexibility. Let me just explore that really briefly. The raison d'etre of any of these technologies has been said to be the efficient transmission of unambiguous information from one individual to another. That's how one person has described it. But, and if you agree with even just part of that description, silence is a suboptimal use of the technology. It can be seen as a possible malfunction on the part of the technology or a strange misuse or negligence on the part of the user. In this sense, these technologies render difficult or abnormal, more passive or receptive types of engagement or communication. Very basic examples of these things include listening, watching, or even being open for communication. And Jareen Pegg, in her discussion about online communication in the previous session, brought this to our attention. She talked about how the students weren't really able to see that she was there in the class, precisely because the signals that would indicate her attention and her focus and her interest were not detectable by the students. So these more passive, more tacit types of communication are filtered out or are not included. In online and embodied contexts, it is possible to register receptivity, availability, and openness, not through active interventions, but in a range of other ways, particularly when no one is speaking for a moment or even for as long as a minute. So if we think about these moments where there might be silence, we can look at how different phenomenologists and philosophers and others have understood the experience of silence. So one really interesting study is by a guy named Dauenhauer, and he talks about how silence shows itself as an act that cannot be performed in radical independence. He's talking about the silence shared by a group of people in various contexts. Silence must indeed someone must indeed act for there to be silence. But this is an act that is not one of any type of active communication that would be registered online, for example. But this person must act in concert with someone or something which is fundamentally distinct from him. There isn't a sense in which he has been ordered from above to be silent, in the sense of the shared silence that Dauenhauer is looking at. And in conversation, for example, this is a key point. The doing of silence opens me to the other. The other in this context needs my yielding in order to reach me. So that silence can indicate in an embodied, shared, co-present context that type of openness or availability, and does so in ways that are a part of the sort of flow of events on the level of seconds or fractions of a second. So online or in a mediated context, the possible meanings of silence must always compete with ones having to do with technical function or malfunction, and with the implied purpose of the technology to serve communication. So what I've done, just to conclude finally, is I've tried to outline a number of these different characteristics of online and offline spaces and places, both from the perspective of simulation and also more generally in terms of their interchangeability or non-interchangeability, for example, for different contexts. One of the things that I found in my study that was really interesting is how a space like this one here is multi-purpose in a way that often escapes our reflection. So let's just think about the telecenter overall. You can have discussions in the hallway. You can be silent in a room like this. You can talk to your neighbor. There's all of these different possibilities that can or cannot be utilized. And the way that a positive learning space is constructed and designed is to allow for that multi-purpose nature, as opposed to the way that it very often works online, which is to sort of say, okay, well, we're having a chat now. It's informal. Let's go to a chat window. Or now we're having a discussion. This is more formal. I want to post a long answer to your questions. That type of multi-purpose flexibility, which in some ways is also a function of our bodies, is something that the dynamics of which really change online. So the abstract, functional, and optimizable spaces of the computer screen certainly have their place in education. The very interchangeability, renewability, and convenience that these spaces offer give them an educational value that is in many ways really easy to recognize and affirm. But they should not be emphasized blindly over the places and experiences of the embodied, particular, and the non-interchangeable. And through our bodies, we are constantly returning to these, or having to return to these. And getting the balance right between the two of them is a key challenge for all of us. Thanks for your attention. Sure. No, we do, actually. Yes, I mean the examples that I've been contrasting here are in some ways at the extremes, and there's many ways to understand the technical, the types of the aspects of the simulation or of communication where those extremes or those poles come together. So one example is the way some people are using Skype these days, when they have internet on all the time, right? And let's say you're living in a different city than your significant other. You can keep Skype on all the time, right? And people do this. They fall asleep, in different cities, essentially with the screen on, and they're sort of with their significant other, their lover. So, and that is a type of sort of telepresence, or a way of and a way of overcoming distance in which silence retains a lot of the significance that it does in physical co-presence. So I'm not sure about the example you're talking about. I can't speak to that in detail, but certainly there would be ways of doing that also with simulation. So.
I just wondered if you had experience engaging the learners in attending these spaces.
Right. That's a really good question. I had the chance to teach a little graduate session on phenomenology at Thomson Reuters University, and it was really interesting because we were able to, use some of these technologies in this way. But one of the things I found that's interesting, actually, one of the things that I've done is in that context and also with other students in other contexts, is try to use the sort of an iPod exercise or an MP3 player exercise, and to walk around in the world listening to music. And the strange thing that's happened is that the students that I've been working with actually resist that exercise because they don't like the technology. They don't use it habitually, and they don't like to use it. So they didn't feel natural in undertaking that type of experiment. And so sometimes that's also an issue where there's students who are drawn to phenomenology are drawn specifically because of their unease in some of those contexts. Oh, right, yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. How? Oh, okay. Uh-huh. Oh, yeah. Okay, okay. Right, right. I think that it might be possible to sort of see something like that as successful given some fairly clearly defined outcomes in terms of if you were doing it in terms of something like the Stanford experiments, where authority and subservience are roles that are experimented with or something. There's lots of one of the things the reason that I brought that up, and I actually didn't have a chance to sort of tie that back in at the end, is that one of the things that computers can't do, and there was a paragraph that I just sort of skipped over, one of the things that goes against the logic of simulation is the idea of deprival and inconvenience. So there's certainly, I don't agree with Prensky that you can experience somehow, or you want to be able to experience the true horror of the concentration camps in all of its dimensions or something, which seems to be what he's implying. But the idea is that, I mean, how do you by making an ever richer simulation simulate something like inconvenience, painstaking difficulty, or simply just being deprived of security, bodily safety, and other aspects of an experience that would not even go very deeply into what that type of experience was like. That's one of the counter arguments that came up in the discussion that I had with a number of philosophers of technology. Is well, you could just make the experience of the frog richer. You could have the person fly through the blood veins of the frog or of the animal that they're dissecting and see all the aspects. But the thing is, well, what about the tininess and the difficulty of getting at some organ that's buried underneath another one? I mean, how do you simulate that in a way that people wouldn't experience as just being some kind of arbitrary imposed limitation on the simulation? So, on the technology. Sure. Sorry? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the formula of simulation equals reality minus task-irrelevant elements. I think the way that relates to silence is that it's very difficult to understand what is a task-irrelevant element in silence. So, and one of the things that happens is that in silence is that it, and people have written about this, is that it foregrounds the body and the affective aspects of those who are co-present in a silent situation. It also has the effect of highlighting the fact that those people who are in that room are in fact there and either are attentive or are not attentive. In the educational literature, there's actually maybe about 4 or 5 different ways of understanding silence, both positively and negatively. I mean, it's seen as a type of this is also part of the ambiguity. I mean, how do you separate this out? It's seen as anything from being non-compliance on the part of students that are being asked questions to expression of studious concentration. And then there's a number of aspects in between. And of course, it can be all of those things. It can also, of course, be the expression of being silenced, right? I mean, the types of significance for silence it explodes into many, many possibilities and many, many politically loaded possibilities, actually, too. Sure.
I have a comment that leads to a question.
Okay.
My comment is first that many of the things that you touched on here in terms of strangeness and noisiness that come with the real really resonate with a whole range of experiential learning forms, including one with communities. People like Mark Kinley and he's been really emphasizing how is the noisiness contingent source so important to learning. But that leads me to my question, which I think has to do with the ontology and epistemology. So we've heard this morning a lot of emphasis on reflection, which is really big in some of the service learning. Here there's a real focus on the kind of relationship and contingency of experience, and reflection would focus more on how do I know what I know, right? What do I know? Where does that knowledge come from? How is that relationally created? So I'm curious about, this kind of reflects to Cheryl's question, I think, about students actually then reflecting on, right? How is it they know what they know, given that there are these kinds of questions of strangeness and noisiness going on? Does that
Yeah.
yeah. Where does reflection as a practice fit in here?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I almost need to think about that a little bit. But just off the top of my head, I would say that one of the challenges to reflection, and this happens, this has happened in endless number of discussions of online learning, is that people resort to, people have at hand a vocabulary that is technical itself. And this is a problem because what I've tried to do in talking about silence and talking about communication and sort of embodied co-presence, you have to leave that technical vocabulary behind, because if you look at communication as being information that's transmitted and signals that are given, and you look at how I even use the language like your nonverbal communicative signals are filtered out, right? Well, that's fairly technical vocabulary. The problem is that then the solution becomes, well, how do you restore those? How can you compensate for those? And you can't. It's very difficult to kind of avoid that vocabulary and that way of thinking. And so I think an exercises in reflection. It would be really useful to. There's a type of reflection that is a part of the phenomenological method that Max van Manen developed that is about a reflection on experience, and I would say that that is really relevant. A type of reflection on experience that avoids theoretical explanations, that just looks at, what is the affective experience, like what did you feel like when you really got angry in class and you couldn't say anything, for example. That's really valuable in this connection.
Disturbing. I think you went full agreement with this statement that silence is cannot be radically independent. I think it is radically independent communication.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Lord Buddha, for example, was asked whether God existed or not. He didn't answer. So that's the communication which is both ends. Those who believe or those who don't believe.
Oh, okay.
It makes them independent. It's the highest kind of communication.
Right. Okay. So,
Not teaching.
yeah. So yeah, I will. So the question was, and I just wanted to make sure I got the question. So isn't it the case that this quotation where it says it's an act that cannot be performed in radical independence, isn't this in some ways misleading because, for example, a responsive silence to the question of does God exist is a response that expresses one's independent perspective independently. In some ways. Yeah. So the response to that is actually just that this question or this statement applies to a particular experience of silence, and that silence has many types of significance, and that this one, like again, when I quickly went through this, I just said this applies. Downhauer is explaining silence in terms of a collective experience in, let's say, in a room, and that he's saying that when a room or when a number of people fall silent, he's talking about the experience of sort of falling silent, in a way, and what he's pointing out is that if there's a kind of this spontaneous event that happens, that in some ways it does highlight a certain something that is shared. But again, because silence is has so many different valences and offers so many different possibilities, to leave this up here and to read it out of context, or to read it as a broad statement, it certainly doesn't apply. I agree. Yeah. Sorry.
Questions. First of all, you have an equation, simulation equals.
Reality minus task-irrelevant elements. Yeah.
So what is like the concept of task irrelevant? I think it's a very wide concept.
Yeah.
And in that sense, like for example, you have the, you have this example of the dissection. Like there are certain things that you can imagine task irrelevant, which on the computer you may not see, but in fact are very relevant to what you're doing. You're doing the actual, for example, you're using a scalpel. Is your scalpel sharp or not? Or you're using
Yeah.
other tools that you would be looking at. Or I also can also say that, for example, are you as a student, are you as much interested in doing dissection that as you are actually willing to take all the smell, or because if you're not really if that's the image that is just horrible for you, so obviously that's not the direction that you do. So for the student to know right there on a fraud that is not going to, or where, I mean that's a big learning. So where they are going. So first of all, and this becomes much more, I think, complicated when you bring it out of the simple dissection of the fraud into something that has, for example, psychology with individuals and how to deal with individuals. And so I think it's a very broad thing in there. And maybe you want to a little bit talk about
That's a good question.
percentage, what kind of, is it as a complementary or using, or what is the role of it based on, you know,
Yeah.
because a lot of these task area it's irrelevant. I mean, how we define that actually, but I have, you know, it actually is very important for your simulation and for your teaching. What's the place of it?
So yeah, there's a lot of questions in that you've raised about how is it possible to determine task relevant elements in this formula? How is it? What is the appropriate role, both in reality and perhaps normatively, or what would be an appropriate role for simulation in education? So let me just mention something about the task-relevant elements, and that is that there are, like, if you agree that there are learning outcomes that you can specify in advance for a learning experience, for a learning task, then you can identify task-relevant elements. And I think, you know, it's become so common. It's sort of consensual knowledge that you need to identify objectives at the beginning in teaching, and then work in a course design, and then work towards them. But it's really important to recognize that the experience of learning, and learning, I think, in a more objective sense, is highly, highly contingent. So, for example, one of Bernard Waldenfeld's students written a book about learning, and talks about how the experience of learning, and talks about how it's somewhere between, you know, when you know that you don't yet know something, and then the experience of actually having the notion, the sense that you have learned something. You can also recognize that you've learned only retrospectively. You can't recognize it while you're learning, in a sense. So what I'm trying to say is that, you know, another word that people use for instructional design, which is where this comes from, is learning design. And I think that is really a kind of a falsification of what learning is. Learning is something that at least experientially cannot be designed in advance. And the second question, in terms of how simulations are used and can be used, in the context of the literature on debating simulations versus dissection experiences, is one where the simulation is used as a substitute for the dissection experience, and that I think is problematic because of the point you're raising about task-irrelevant elements. What is irrelevant for the learner, and what is relevant to this contingent experience of learning? You don't really know, and so understanding simulation as a substitution for the real thing, so to speak, is really problematic. However, and I know this happens in medicine, I'd be interested to find out about whether it happens in nursing and other contexts. Simulation is used as a preparation for a more complex dissection activity that happens in a laboratory. And precisely because of its instructional brilliance in terms of it being able to highlight certain things and downplay others, it provides a way of understanding the procedural, explicit activities of the dissection, so that when you're actually there, you're not overwhelmed by, you know, the smell, the sights, the scalpel that needs sharpening, and all these other things that might suddenly arise, and you have no idea what the next step is once you've figured all these things out or got past all these initial issues. So, just a brief response to your questions.
Doesn't seem to be another burning question. So, Norm, you've got me thinking about my practice, thinking very deeply about my practice. Thank you very much. You left us with incredible insights.
Thanks. This is my book, by the way, if you want to read more.